A woman rips off her headscarf in the middle of a Tehran boulevard, sets it on fire, and stands perfectly still as riot police charge toward her. Thousands more follow, chanting three words that shake an entire regime to its core: woman, life, freedom. But this was not a sudden explosion. It was decades of pressure finally breaking through the surface. A story that stretches back to 1979, when a revolution promised liberation but delivered something very different. How did Iran go from one of the most modernizing nations in the Middle East to a theocracy that executes more people per capita than almost any country on earth? That is exactly what we are going to break down today. This is History Lens. To understand why Iranian women are burning hijabs in the streets, you have to go back to a moment when Iran looked nothing like it does today. And that moment was the 1970s under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last king of Iran. The Shah had inherited a modernization project from his father, Reza Shah, who had seized power in the 1920s and tried to drag Iran into the 20th century by force, banning the veil, building railways, and crushing tribal resistance. His son took that vision even further, launching the White Revolution in the 1960s, a series of top-down reforms that included land redistribution, women's suffrage, and massive investment in education and industry. On the surface, Iran was booming. Oil revenues were pouring in, Tehran's skyline was changing, and Iranian women were attending universities, working as judges, and wearing whatever they wanted. But underneath all that glamour, something was rotting, because the Shah's modernization came with a brutal cost, and that cost was political freedom. His secret police force, Saga, which was set up in 1957 with help from the CIA and Israel's Mossad, ran an extensive network of surveillance, torture, and assassination that silenced anyone who dared to oppose the monarchy. Intellectuals disappeared, journalists were jailed, and political parties were banned or turned into rubber stamps for the Shah's agenda, and that created a paradox, a country that looked modern on the outside, but felt like a prison on the inside. The anger was everywhere, among students who wanted democracy, among workers who saw the oil wealth flowing to a tiny elite, and most powerfully among the religious establishment that felt their entire way of life was under attack. The Shah had marginalized the clergy, stripped religious courts of their power, and replaced Islamic law with secular Western-style codes, and for many devout Iranians, this was not progress, it was cultural annihilation. One cleric stood above all others in channeling that fury, and his name was Ruhollah Khomeini, a senior Shia scholar who had been publicly criticizing the Shah since the early 1960s. In 1964, after openly denouncing the Shah's reforms and his alliance with the United States, Khomeini was arrested and then exiled, first to Turkey, then Iraq, and finally France. But exile did not silence him, it amplified him, because from thousands of miles away, his recorded sermons were smuggled into Iran on cassette tapes and passed from hand to hand in mosques, bazaars, and living rooms across the country. His message was simple but devastating. The Shah was a puppet of America, Islam was under siege, and only an Islamic government could deliver true justice for the Iranian people. By the late 1970s, the Shah's regime was collapsing under its own weight. Inflation was spiraling, corruption was rampant, and the gap between the oil-rich elite and ordinary Iranians had become a canyon. In January 1978, a government-backed newspaper published an article attacking Khomeini, and it triggered protests in the holy city of Qom that security forces answered with gunfire, killing several students. That massacre set off a chain reaction because in Shia tradition, mourning ceremonies are held 40 days after a death. And each mourning gathering became a new protest, which led to more killings, which led to more mourning, which led to more protests.
The cycle fed on itself for an entire year, growing larger and more radical with every round, until millions of Iranians from every class and ideology were marching in the streets demanding the Shah's removal.
On September 8, 1978, the military declared martial law in Tehran, and the very next day, soldiers opened fire on thousands of unarmed demonstrators in Jaleh Square, killing hundreds in what became known as Black Friday.
That was the point of no return, because after Black Friday, even moderates who had hoped for gradual reform turned against the monarchy, and the Shah, increasingly isolated and suffering from cancer he had kept secret, finally fled Iran on January 16, 1979. 2 weeks later, on February 1st, Khomeini returned from exile to a hero's welcome, greeted by an estimated 5 million people lining the streets of Tehran, and within 10 days, the last remnants of the monarchy collapsed. The old regime was gone, but what came next was something nobody fully predicted, not even many of those who had fought for the revolution. In a national referendum held on March 30, 1979, Iranians voted overwhelmingly to establish an Islamic Republic, but the ballot offered only one option: Islamic Republic, yes or no, with no alternative system on the table. Khomeini moved quickly to consolidate power, and within months, a new constitution was drafted around his radical concept of velayat-e-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, which placed a single supreme leader above all branches of government, with authority over the military, the judiciary, and national policy. That supreme leader was Khomeini himself, and under his direction, the revolution devoured its own children. Liberals, leftists, nationalists, and even fellow clerics who disagreed with his vision were systematically purged. Revolutionary courts handed down death sentences with terrifying speed, and within the first few years, thousands of political prisoners were executed, many after trials that lasted only minutes. The new regime wasted no time remaking Iranian society from the ground up. Mandatory hijab was imposed on all women, Western music and movies were banned, alcohol was outlawed, and morality police began patrolling the streets to enforce Islamic dress codes. Universities were shut down for 3 years in what the regime called a cultural revolution, designed to purge secular and leftist faculty and replace Western curricula with Islamic content. Then, in November 1979, radical students seized the American embassy in Tehran, taking 66 diplomats hostage and holding 52 of them for 444 days. The hostage crisis became a defining moment, not just for Iran, but for its relationship with the entire Western world. It destroyed any chance of diplomatic normalization with the United States and turned Iran into an international pariah almost overnight. A failed American rescue mission called Operation Eagle Claw, which ended with 8 U.S. servicemen dead in the Iranian desert, deepened the humiliation on both sides and cemented a mutual hostility that has lasted for decades. The hostages were finally released on January 20, 1981, the exact moment Ronald Reagan was being sworn in as president, a final act of spite aimed at the outgoing Jimmy Carter. But just as the hostage crisis was ending, an even greater catastrophe was beginning, because in September 1980, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein launched a full-scale invasion of Iran, hoping to exploit the revolutionary chaos and seize the oil-rich province of Khuzestan. What Saddam expected to be a quick war turned into 8 years of grinding, devastating conflict that killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people on both sides. Iraq used chemical weapons extensively, including mustard gas and nerve agents, against both Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians, and the international community largely looked the other way because Western powers, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait were backing Iraq with money and weapons. For Iran, the war became sacred. The regime called it the Sacred Defense and sent waves of young volunteers, some barely teenagers, to the front lines with promises of martyrdom and paradise. The war transformed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps from a small revolutionary militia into a massive military, political, and economic institution that would come to dominate Iranian life for decades.
When Khomeini finally accepted a UN-brokered ceasefire in 1988, he compared it to drinking poison.
And just weeks later, in a final act of brutality, the regime carried out mass executions of political prisoners across the country. Estimates range from several thousand to as many as 30,000 killed in what became one of the darkest chapters in the Islamic republics.
History, and it happened with almost no international attention.
Khomeini died in June 1989, and the system he built did not die with him. It simply adapted because the constitution already had a mechanism for succession, and Ali Khamenei, a relatively junior cleric at the time, was selected as the new supreme leader. Khamenei lacked Khomeini's charismatic authority, but he compensated by building a vast network of institutional control, gradually tightening his grip over the judiciary, the military, the intelligence services, and the Guardian Council that vets all candidates for public office. The post-war era brought a brief window of pragmatism under President Rafsanjani in the 1990s, followed by the reformist presidency of Mohammad Khatami, who won a landslide in 1997 on promises of civil liberties, press freedom, and what he called a dialogue among civilizations.
Khatami's election electrified young Iranians and raised hopes for real change.
But every reform he attempted was blocked by the conservative establishment. Hardline judges shut down over 100 newspapers, arrested activists and journalists, and the Guardian Council disqualified reformist candidates from running for office. The message was clear. You can vote, but you cannot change anything that threatens the supreme leader's power. And that lesson would be driven home even more brutally in the years ahead. In 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad won the presidency, and his era marked a sharp turn toward confrontation, both at home and abroad, with Holocaust denial, threats against Israel, and a dramatic expansion of Iran's nuclear program. Iran's nuclear ambitions had actually begun under the Shah in the 1970s with American help, but after the revolution, the program continued in secret, and by the early 2000s, Western intelligence agencies were raising alarms about enrichment facilities that could produce weapons-grade uranium. The International Atomic Energy Agency repeatedly found that Iran was not fully cooperating with inspections, and a covert program known as Project Ahmad, which reportedly operated from the late 1990s to about 2003,
was focused on developing nuclear warheads for ballistic missiles like the Shahab-3. Under Ahmadinejad, Iran accelerated enrichment and built new facilities, including one buried deep inside a mountain at Fordo, which was so fortified that conventional airstrikes could not easily destroy it. International sanctions tightened dramatically, cutting Iran off from the global banking system and slashing its oil exports, and the economic pain fell hardest on ordinary Iranians, while the elite connected to the IRGC actually profited. The IRGC had by this point become an economic empire of its own, controlling an estimated $15 to $25 billion worth of construction, telecommunications, oil, and import businesses. And that economic stranglehold meant that sanctions enriched the powerful while crushing the middle class. Then came 2009, when Ahmadinejad claimed victory in a presidential election that millions of Iranians believed was stolen, and the streets of Tehran erupted in the largest protests since the revolution itself. The Green Movement, as it became known, brought millions into the streets under the slogan, "Where is my vote?" And for a brief moment, it seemed like the Islamic Republic might actually face a genuine challenge from within. The regime responded with overwhelming force, arresting thousands, torturing detainees in notorious facilities like Karizak,
and killing protesters, including a young woman named Neda Aga Sultan, whose death, captured on a cell phone camera, became one of the most watched videos in internet history. The Green Movement was crushed. Its leaders, Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, were placed under house arrest, where they remain to this day, and the regime learned a critical lesson. Any sign of weakness invites more dissent. So the response must always be brutal and immediate. After the trauma of Ahmadinejad's years, a more moderate figure, Hassan Rouhani, won the presidency in 2013 with promises to ease sanctions and open Iran to the world. In 2015, Iran and 6 world powers signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which limited Iran's nuclear enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. And for a brief moment, it looked like Iran might finally break out of its isolation. But that window slammed shut in 2018 when U.S. President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew from the deal, calling it the worst deal ever negotiated, and reimposed crippling sanctions that sent the Iranian economy into freefall. The rial lost most of its value, inflation skyrocketed, and in November 2019, when the government suddenly raised fuel prices, protests erupted across Iran that were met with a level of violence that shocked even seasoned observers. According to Reuters, security forces killed approximately 1,500 protesters in just 2 weeks, many shot with live ammunition from rooftops and helicopters, while the government imposed a near-total internet blackout to prevent the world from seeing what was happening. The pattern was becoming tragically familiar: economic despair, protest, and then massacre. But in September 2022, something shifted in a way the regime did not anticipate. A 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini was detained by Iran's morality police in Tehran for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly, and 3 days later she was dead. Witnesses said she had been beaten, and her death ignited a firestorm that spread to every corner of the country under the slogan Jin Jian Azadi, which is Kurdish for woman, life, freedom. What made the 2022 protests different was that women and girls were leading them, cutting their hair in public, dancing without hijabs, and directly confronting security forces in acts of defiance that the regime had never faced at this scale. The state killed at least 500 people, including dozens of children, arrested around 20,000, and carried out targeted executions of protest leaders. But even after the streets quieted, the defiance did not disappear. It went underground and into daily life. In 2024, reformist candidate Masoud Pezeshkian won the presidential election on promises of dialogue and better governance, but he inherited a system that was structurally incapable of reform, because real power remained with Khamenei and the IRGC, not the elected president. Then, in June 2025, everything escalated when Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, striking Iran's nuclear facilities at Natanz and Fordo, along with military targets across the country, in what became known as the 12-Day War. Iran retaliated with waves of ballistic missiles aimed at Israeli cities, but the damage to Iran's nuclear infrastructure was devastating, and the war ended with a ceasefire that left Iran humiliated and economically shattered. In September 2025, the United Nations reimposed sanctions through the snapback mechanism, freezing Iranian assets abroad and further strangling the economy. And by December, the Iranian rial had collapsed to record lows. Inflation hit 42%, and food prices surged by over 70%. On December 28, 2025, shopkeepers in Tehran's bazaars shut their doors and took to the streets, and within days, the protests had spread to over 200 cities across all 31 provinces in what became the largest uprising since 1979 itself. This time, the protesters were not just students or women. They were merchants, workers, retirees, ethnic minorities, and even some military defectors, chanting "Death to the dictator" and "Neither Gaza nor Lebanon, my life for Iran." On January 8, 2026, After exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi called for unified demonstrations, an estimated 5 million people took to the streets nationwide, and the regime responded with its most brutal crackdown in history. Security forces opened fire with live ammunition on unarmed crowds, and when the internet was shut down to hide the scale of the killing, hospitals in Tehran and Shiraz were overflowing with gunshot victims, many shot in the head and eyes. Human rights organizations confirmed over 7,000 deaths, while some reports put the toll as high as 36,000, making this the deadliest government crackdown on civilians in modern Iranian history. On February 11th, President Pezeshkian took the unprecedented step of publicly apologizing to the nation for the crackdown, but by then the damage was irreversible, and on February 21st, a second wave of protests erupted, led by university students. 1 week later, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in his Tehran compound, along with senior military commanders, plunging the country into uncharted territory. As of right now, Iran is a nation at a crossroads, unlike any it has faced in its modern history. With its supreme leader dead, its nuclear program in ruins, its economy in free fall, and millions of its people demanding a fundamentally different future. The story of Iran since 1979 is not just a story about one country. It is a story about what happens when a revolution eats itself, when ideology replaces governance, and when a government treats its own people as the enemy. For over 4 decades, Iranians have been told that their suffering is the price of resistance against foreign enemies. But generation after generation keeps asking the same question: resistance for whom? The hijabs burning in the streets of Tehran are not just pieces of cloth on fire. They are symbols of a people who have decided that the cost of silence is finally greater than the cost of rebellion. Where Iran goes from here, nobody knows. But one thing is certain: the people of Iran are no longer waiting for permission to decide their own future.